And if it were not for people from the Philippines, the Catholic churches in Victoria would be almost empty. Both Unitarian congregations in Victoria are doing okay. COVID hit us hard, but Zoom has kept Sunday morning numbers at pre-pandemic levels. The newsletter blurb said that COVID closed religious houses around the world and many switched to Zoom. Now that the pandemic is largely over, in-person church attendance has not recovered. But declines in church attendance started many years ago. What happened to Sunday mornings? Where is everyone? And will people return to the pews? The preamble to the Unitarian principles and sources say, where's Karen? We, the member congregations, covenant to affirm and promote, etc. Today's service addresses key questions about why our neighbors have been closing their doors and why we, the member Unitarian congregations, constantly welcome ex-Anglicans and ex-United Church people who seek meaning and community. The decline in church attendance is not new. Alexis de Tocqueville, the remarkable Frenchman who produced Democracy in America in 1840, possibly the most penetrating sociological analysis of a culture ever made. De Tocqueville said the gravest warning was that individualism in the United States would, if unchecked, lead to a new form of despotism. Tocqueville foresaw a day when Americans would stray away from religion. In 1831, he wrote that, and his forecast would turn out to be correct, although he probably couldn't have imagined why. Charles Darwin's grandfathers, Erasmus Darwin and Josiah Wedgwood, he of the famous blue and white Wedgwood pottery, were both free thinkers and abolitionists. Both families were largely Unitarian, though the Wedgwoods were adopting Anglicanism. Robert Darwin, the freethinker, had his son Charles baptized in the Anglican tradition, but Charles and his siblings attended the local Unitarian church with their mother. As a young man, puzzled by the geographical distribution of wildlife and fossils he collected, Charles Darwin began detailed investigations and in 1838 devised his theory of natural selection. Charles Darwin's work established evolutionary descent with modification as the dominant scientific explanation of diversification in nature. Darwin published his theory of evolution with compelling evidence in his 1859 book On the Origin of Species. And by the 1870s in England and in North America, the scientific community and a majority of the educated public had accepted evolution as fact. The Church of England's response was mixed. Darwin's old Cambridge tutors dismissed the ideas, but liberal clergymen interpreted natural selection as an instrument of God's design. Historical criticism had already started and gained popular recognition by the time Darwin's book came out. The perspective of the early historical critic was rooted in Protestant Reformation ideology. People start actually reading the Bible for themselves and deciding for themselves what it means. That can be dangerous. During the time of Charles Darwin, the approach to higher criticism set aside efforts to fill ancient religion with direct meaning and relevance, and devoted itself instead to the critical collection and chronological ordering of the source material. Thus, higher criticism, whether biblical, classical, Byzantine, or medieval, focuses on the source documents to determine who wrote them, where they wrote them, and when they wrote them. The starting position of such criticism is that the books of the Bible were written by humans in a narrow geographical range during the Bronze Age. Many people who heard the results of higher criticism saw that Bible stories and church teachings lacked God-given authority in the 1870s and 1880s. The debates brought about by higher criticism and the doubts about biblical creation that were sparked by Darwin's work caused perceptible declines in church attendance in England, France, and Germany during the late 1800s. long before the music of the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, and even before the First World War, church attendance was waning. The First World War caused further declines in church attendance, measurable in Canada. Many civil leaders and army generals were shown to lack authority when it came to bringing the war to a swift and decisive end. The slow breakdown of trust in those authorities was added to the gradual loss of trust in religious figures, especially those clerics who spoke of glorious martyrdom of so many Canadian soldiers and sailors. The men and women who returned to Canada from the mud and gore of Flanders never again stepped foot into church. There's a study that I wrote, and I couldn't put my hands on it last night, of United Church ministers from Canada, who Methodists and later United Church, I suppose, who went over as chaplains and padres to the First World War. So these were people who were already trained, went to the war to do their duty as chaplains. And when they came back, never stepped foot in church again, never preached the gospel again, and were disconnected from religion. Let me fast forward to a time that many of you remember, the 1960s. Although they say that if you remember the 1960s, you weren't really there. In 1965, the Canadian Anglican Church commissioned a report. The report was authored by a 45-year-old journalist and broadcaster named Pierre Burton. Burton called his report "The Comfortable Pew," a critical look at Christianity and the religious establishment in the New Age. Pierre Burton offered a blistering critique of the church that he viewed as irrelevant to mainstream society, locked in a tired vision from the past. He said that the church had failed as an instrument of social justice and no longer served as a conscience for the nation, holding people accountable to a higher ethical standard. In Burton's view, the church had surrendered the status quo to the status quo and was refusing to shake people up, challenging them to live truly Christian lives. The church, as Pierre Burton saw it in 1965, was nothing more than a comfortable pew. Does anyone here know if the Anglican Church has changed remarkably since 1965? They have female clergy now, and the church is no longer involved in the Indian residential schools. My dad told me that in Vancouver in 1969, when he was the treasurer of West Point Grey United Church, the congregation worshipped the Point Grey neighborhood first and Jesus second. To me, Pierre Burton's 1965 report leads me to think of what happened after my parents stopped attending the United Church in the late 1960s. Post-Christian adults raise unchurched kids. This might be why the youth group of Capital Unitarian Universalist congregation are aged 59 to 61. And there is no next generation. The generational transfer is important. Generational transfer is central to the work of one of my favorite sociologists of religion. We all need a favorite sociologist of religion. Dr. Abby Day writes that churches in England are run by women who are now in their late 80s and 90s, and there is not a next generation to take up the slack when they die. At the start of this homily, I said that 15 years from now, there will be no Anglicans in Victoria. In 2014, Abby Day wrote in a British Anglican journal, "Older women do a great deal more than keep the pews warm. They are significant leaders in their churches, and they are not being replaced." These unique Anglican women, members of what Abby Day calls Generation A, born in the 1920s and 30s, mothers of the baby boomers, grandmothers and great-grandmothers of generations X, Y, and Z. These are the older women laity, often invisible and unacknowledged as they lead from the pews, who rarely have time to take tea and talk about sex because they are too busy hauling heavy boxes up and down church stairs for the jumble sale, or dusting and polishing, or organizing the rota of duties. This may well be the final active generation of the Church of England, Abby Day concludes, because their descendants are not replacing them. In losing this generation, the church will not just be losing numbers, but a kind of labor, leadership, and knowledge which has quietly kept churches going. This pew power is different from priestly leadership, but has been instrumental to church life. Dr. Abby Day says that when this generation of older church ladies dies out, the church will have to close its doors. She wrote that in 2014. She was in Victoria last fall and said that churches all across England are shut because there's nobody even to open the doors to let people come in out of the rain. I have more cheerful news. From Tacoma, Washington, writing about religion in the Pacific Northwest, Dr. Patricia O'Connell-Killen says that early settlers in Cascadia, British Columbia, Washington, Tacoma, the part of the west coast that drains rain off the Cascade Mountains. Settlers in this resource-rich region, which, like the existing Aboriginals, were forced to move to survive, to find the best places to log, fish, and mine. The early settlers that came here didn't bring established religion, as they had in the Pacific, on the East Coast and in central Canada. At a theological level, Killen says that with jobs and riches often provided by nature's bounty, hopes of a better financial future were no longer tied to being moral and upright. Many residents of Cascadia learned it may not have been a supreme being, but sheer hustle, luck, and location that determined whether one fell by the economic wayside or joined the economic elite. Cascadia's geography-inspired mobility continues today. The recent census showed a remarkable 60% of the residents of Greater Vancouver were not born in BC. In Greater Vancouver, 36% of all residents are actually born outside Canada, typically from Asia. This rare phenomenon makes the city one of the most cosmopolitan in the world. Cascadians' tendency to be on the move leads to a psychological mobility, as Dr. Killen says. Fewer Cascadians bother to sign up with institutions, religious or otherwise. Combining mobility with ethnic diversity, Killen points out the highly significant finding that no single religion has ever come to dominate the Pacific Northwest. Cascadians don't realize how rare this is. With no religion reigning supreme in the region, Dr. Killen believes many Cascadians lose an incentive to define themselves religiously, either by joining the reigning religious body or by actively opposing it. In other words, Cascadians spend a lot of time wondering exactly who they are. Spiritually speaking, most Cascadians, Cascadia, British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, most Cascadians drift, albeit often rather contentedly. Meanwhile, those who do not commit to a religious path, whether conservative or progressive, tend to be passionate about it since they've made a choice that counters the dominant ethos. British Columbians appear to have the greatest receptiveness of all Canadians to unstructured experiences of divinity. While most Americans and Canadians use traditional language about Jesus and heaven to describe their beliefs, British Columbians are more likely to opt for open-ended expressions of spirituality. For instance, more than 41% of British Columbians claim they have had a religious or mystical experience, compared to the Canadian national average of just 29%. Such spiritual individualism is a hallmark of life here in Cascadia. Dr. Killen points us toward answers to the homily's questions. Where did they go? Will they come back? The answers might be that we in Victoria are surrounded by spiritual people who do not want church for their spirituality. Will they come back? No, they're not coming back. They were never here. Attempts have been made to gain new adherents. 20 years ago, the United Church of Canada initiated the Wonder Cafe with a high-profile nationwide advertising campaign. Wonder Cafe was a total flop. nobody new came to the United Church, and dissatisfaction with the program likely led to a net loss of United Church members and ministers. In BC in 1992, there was a Lutheran Synod program called Let's Grow. Hopes were high, but it never worked out. And Lutherans in British Columbia went from 18,000 members in 1992 to 8,000 members 20 years later. In 10 years, within 5 years from now, 60% of Lutheran pastors will retire. No new clergy are coming from seminaries to be Lutheran pastors, and few new people are joining congregations. So the congregations are getting smaller. In Vancouver in the 1990s, a bold move was made. They sold their parsonage, one of the big Lutheran churches, to specifically set up a Chinese ministry. They hired a Chinese minister who was a Lutheran, and that Chinese minister started a Chinese-speaking Lutheran church. It went nowhere. It's gone now, and the Lutherans have spent all of their money at that one congregation in Vancouver. Similar to Anglican and United cases, with notable exceptions like Victoria's Lutheran Church of the Cross, the Lutherans are also dying out and drifting away. Let me put a plug in for our sister church, the West Saanich Road Unitarians. They have vitality, good music, brilliant ministers, and periodic celebrations to welcome new members. The pandemic was hard on the First Unitarian Church, but they are pulling through. So my conclusions. The newsletter blurb said that now that the pandemic is largely over, in-person church attendance has not recovered. But declines in church attendance started many years ago. What happened to Sunday mornings? Will people come back? Before the pandemic, capital services often had 30 adults attending and no children. Certain speakers drew up to 40 adults. During the pandemic years, but not because of the pandemic, we lost 20% of our members. But Zoom gave us new life. We have around 40 people attending our services on most Sundays, 25 in the room and 15 on Zoom. Capital Unitarian services are regularly attended by Linda in PEI, Jim in Hawaii, and congregants on extended holidays in Mexico and California. 3 years ago, I was in Parksville for the weekend, and Zoom technology allowed me to attend Larry's service about Unitarianism in South Africa, along with members of the Cape Town congregation and their minister. How great was that, Larry? The final question in my ad blurb was, will people return to the pews? And the answer is probably no. Unitarianism will continue to draw a few ex-Christians and ex-Jews each year, but nothing like the boom years of the 1830s and the 1960s. The Unitarian messages of social justice, environmental care, and individual search for truths and meanings doesn't stand out from the typical lefty, progressive, electric car, save the trees, Vancouver Island mindset. What we offer that is unique is a community that is concerned for one another. We sing together, check in with each other, visit each other in hospital, and mourn our losses together. Those are beautiful, wonderful activities that only happen in congregations like ours. Blessed be, and amen.